Have you ever looked out the window on a quiet spring morning and realized your life had grown so still? You could almost hear your own heart waiting for something, anything to change. My name is Martha Bennett, and if you passed by my little house on the edge of Willow Lake in Wisconsin, you might think nothing ever happened here. The truth is, most days glide by in gentle repetition: a fresh pot of coffee, the soft creak of the porch swing, the newspaper folded on the table, and the sound of geese landing on the water just beyond my yard. I wasn't always alone in this place. My late husband George built this house with his own hands, each plank, each nail, a promise that our family would always have a place to return to. There were years filled with laughter echoing across the kitchen, birthdays with too many candles, and weekends when our son James would race his toy boats across the shallow end of the lake. These days, though, it's mostly just me, the gentle hush of memories, and a quiet that sometimes feels heavier than winter snow. People say you should get used to solitude as you get older, but no one tells you how silence can grow roots stretching into every corner of a home. I fill my days with small rituals: baking banana bread with walnuts, tending to the stubborn tulips that refuse to bloom on time, and waving to the mail carrier, even when I know there's nothing coming for me. I tell myself it's enough, this simple, careful living, but deep down, I still check my phone for James's name, hoping for a text or a call, some small proof that a mother is never truly forgotten. It was on one of those cool, golden mornings that the call finally came. The phone rang, and for a moment I hesitated, almost afraid to hope. James's voice, cheerful but hurried, filled the kitchen. He was getting married, he said. Her name was Clara. The wedding would be in just a few weeks, nothing too fancy, but they were excited. I listened, heart thudding, waiting for an invitation to help to be needed, or at least to share in the joy. Instead, he said they had it all handled, just come and celebrate. He told me before, hanging up with promises to call again soon. As I stood there holding the silent phone, I felt a shift, subtle but certain. It's funny how even the smallest changes in a family can feel like an earthquake when your world has grown so still. I pressed my palm to the window, watching the breeze ripple across Willow Lake, and wondered if this new chapter would bring us closer, or show me just how far apart we had drifted. One thing was certain: this spring would not pass as quietly as the ones before. The invitation arrived not with a flourish, but tucked inside a plain white envelope, the address written in Clara's careful script. I found it waiting in the mailbox one morning, wedged between a grocery flyer and a bill. I stood at the kitchen counter, tracing my finger over my name, just Martha Bennett, no mother of the groom, no extra note. Inside the card was tasteful pale blue with silver edges. James and Clara invite you to celebrate their wedding. I searched for something more, a scribbled note, a private message, but found only the printed words and the neat, impersonal details. I set the invitation down beside my mug and took a long breath, feeling a mix of pride and ache. Of course I was happy for James. Isn't every mother supposed to be? Still, there was a hollowness in the formality, a quiet reminder that my role had shifted from center to periphery. I replayed our last phone call in my mind, wondering if I had missed some unspoken message. The world doesn't always announce when you've become a guest in your own story. Sometimes you just open the mail and know. Real life rarely unfolds the way it does in movies. I'd imagined being swept up in planning, helping Clara choose flowers, or at least baking cookies for the rehearsal dinner. Instead, I watched the days tick by, waiting for a second call that never came. I baked anyway, a batch of sugar cookies pressed with a fork, the way James liked as a boy, and tucked them in the freezer just in case. I told myself not to be silly, that grown children build their own lives, but it's hard to stop old habits. A mother's love, after all, doesn't check the calendar before showing up. Sometimes I think about all the little things that go unsaid between family members, the missed opportunities, the conversations left for later. When James was young, he used to run home from school and launch straight into stories about his day. Now, our talks are brief and careful, skimming the surface of our lives. I tried to remember the last time he'd asked what I was reading, or how the tulips were coming along. It's not that he's unkind, just distant, like he's speaking from another shore waving across the water, but never quite close enough to reach. That feeling settled over me as I reread the invitation, weighing whether to RSVP yes or no. I wondered if Clara's mother would be included in the planning, if she would know which cake flavors James hated, or how he always forgot to tie his left shoe at special events. I wondered, too, if it even mattered. There's a particular kind of ache that comes from realizing your knowledge, your care has quietly become obsolete. Still, I circled the date on my calendar and set about preparing a dress, convincing myself that showing up is its own act of love. I think many parents experience this slow drift, this quiet letting go that nobody warns you about. We're told to raise our children to be independent, to send them out into the world. But nobody says how strange it will feel to watch them stand on their own, not needing your guidance, or your hands not even realizing the absence. That's the paradox, I suppose. The more successful you are at loving them, the more invisible your efforts become. It's a lesson I'm still learning, one gentle surrender at a time. On the morning of the wedding, I stood by the window, holding the pale blue invitation in my hand, letting the sun warm my skin. There was a lesson in that moment, a small truth that I hope I remember. You can love deeply and still be left outside the circle sometimes. It doesn't mean you failed. It just means life is moving as it always does, in ways that ask you to be braver, softer, more accepting. I tucked the invitation into my purse, smoothed my dress, and gathered my things for the journey ahead, hoping if not for a seat at the center, then at least for the grace to belong somewhere in the room. In the days leading up to the wedding, I poured my nervous energy into preparation. The house smelled of lemon polish and fresh laundry, as if I could sweep away old sadness with the scent of clean linens. I laid my favorite dress, a dusky blue, simple but elegant, across the bed, and checked the hem, recalling how George once said the color made my eyes look younger. It had been years since I wore it anywhere special, but somehow it felt right for this day, a small act of hope stitched into every seam. I made a list of things to bring: a shawl for the evening chill, my good pearl earrings, and a little box of sugar cookies wrapped in wax paper. I even packed a small photo of James as a child, his gap-toothed grin framed by a sun hat, a quiet reminder of a time when he looked for me in every crowd. Packing these things was more than just practical. It was my way of carrying pieces of our shared history into a moment that felt in so many ways unfamiliar. The day before the wedding, I baked banana bread early in the morning, the same recipe I'd used since James was small. The house filled with a sweet, familiar warmth, and I couldn't help but wonder if any of that warmth would reach him now. I wrapped the loaf carefully, knowing it might go uneaten, but the ritual mattered. Sometimes when love can't find the right words, it shows up as a loaf of banana bread, or a hand-stitched hem, or simply a mother standing quietly at the edge of the room. I decided to drive myself to the venue, taking the winding back roads that passed by the old church and the stretch of pine forest where we used to go for family walks. Along the way, memories flickered like sunlight through the trees, James splashing in puddles, George laughing as he carried him on his shoulders. I let myself smile at those memories, not out of longing, but gratitude. It's easy to forget when life moves quickly, that even brief moments of happiness can become anchors in rough waters. When I arrived at the lakeside resort, I took a moment in the car to collect myself, smoothing my skirt and taking 3 slow, steady breaths. The parking lot was filled with unfamiliar cars, families gathered in clusters, laughter rising above the murmur of greetings. I watched as Clara's parents hugged guests, their faces bright with welcome, and I wondered just for a moment if anyone would be waiting to welcome me. It's a quiet kind of courage, I think, to walk into a room where you're not sure you're needed, but to show up anyway. That's the thing about hope, it's stubborn. It lingers in the small choices we make, the effort we put into making things just right, even when the outcome is uncertain. There's a lesson in that too. Sometimes the act of preparing, of caring, is for ourselves as much as for anyone else. In honoring these old rituals, I was reminding myself of who I was, a mother who shows up even when her place isn't reserved, even when her voice isn't asked for. By the time I finally stepped into the lobby, the sunlight was slanting through the tall windows, painting golden stripes across the floor. I held my head high, carrying my little box of cookies and the banana bread in my tote, determined to let kindness lead me through whatever waited inside. I realized then that the real gift wasn't the baked goods or the perfectly chosen dress. It was the decision to arrive with an open heart, despite the uncertainty. As the glass doors slid open and the sounds of celebration spilled out, I took one last breath and stepped into the unknown, ready to find my place, even if it meant building it gently from scratch. The reception hall glowed with candlelight laughter swirling in the air like ribbons. I paused at the entrance, taking in the sweep of white linen tables and delicate floral centerpieces, my breath catching on the hum of celebration. A young woman with a clipboard approached and smiled politely, her eyes skimming my name tag, before leading me toward a table in the far corner. "You're with Group 8?" she said, gesturing toward a cluster of strangers. There was no mention of mother of the groom, no reserved sign, just a card with my name printed in neat generic font. I took my seat next to a couple from out of town and an older man who introduced himself as Clara's uncle, though I didn't catch his name the first time. They chatted easily, trading stories of ski trips and kitchen remodels, while I listened quietly, folding and refolding the napkin in my lap. Every so often, my eyes would wander across the room searching for James. I caught sight of him near the head table, arm wrapped around Clara, radiant and busy. I tried to catch his eye, but he was swept along by waves of well-wishers, smiles, and toasts. During the speeches, I waited for a nod, a word, or some tiny gesture in my direction. Clara's father spoke first, weaving childhood memories and loving jokes. Her mother followed, voice thick with pride. A college friend shared a funny story about a road trip gone wrong. When the microphone passed, someone asked if the groom's mother might want to speak. Clara laughed gently, maybe later. The moment floated by unnoticed, except by me, and the microphone moved on. I pressed my lips together, a bittersweet smile fixed in place. Dinner arrived in careful courses, a crisp salad, a slice of roasted chicken, a mound of mashed potatoes dusted with herbs. The food was beautiful, but I barely tasted it. Around me, conversations swelled and receded, strangers connecting over shared appetizers and distant family ties. I tried to contribute a comment about the music, a compliment for the flowers, but my words felt like small stones dropped in a rushing stream, quickly swept away. I reminded myself that sometimes showing up is the bravest thing we can do, even when it feels like standing on the outskirts. After dinner, the dance floor filled quickly. I watched as Clara and James spun together, laughter rising above the music. Then Clara's mother, her friends, and aunts all welcomed in turn. The DJ announced, "Let's have all the important women of the couple's life join us." I hesitated, unsure if that included me. No one beckoned, so I stayed seated, running my finger along the edge of my water glass. Sometimes the sharpest ache isn't exclusion, it's uncertainty, the subtle doubt that creeps in when no one quite knows where you fit. It struck me then how easy it is in the middle of joy for someone's absence to go unnoticed. People assume everyone is having a good time, that no one is left out. But sometimes loneliness blooms quietly, even in a crowded room. I thought about how often we measure our worth by invitations, by how close we're seated to the center, forgetting that love is not always measured in proximity. It can be found in showing up and quietly holding space for others, and in giving yourself grace when the world seems to forget. As the evening wound down, plates were cleared, and guests began to drift toward the exit. I gathered my tote, the untouched banana bread still inside. No one stopped me as I left. In the parking lot, I paused under the soft glow of a street lamp, feeling the night's gentle chill. I realized with a mix of sadness and relief that some chapters don't offer grand closure. They simply end with the soft closing of a door. That, too, is a lesson. Sometimes belonging is not given, but chosen, claimed quietly by the act of continuing on. Driving home, the road unfurled before me in silence. The stars blinked above the pines, the world settling into its gentle, indifferent rhythm. I promised myself that whatever came next, I would hold on to the quiet bravery it took to walk into that hall, to sit in my own company, and to let the night unfold as it must. The house would be waiting, its familiar warmth and steady walls, ready to greet me as I stepped into the next unknown. A few days after the wedding, the phone rang just as I was folding towels in the living room. I recognized James's number and picked up quickly, tucking the receiver between my shoulder and ear. His voice sounded cheerful, almost rehearsed, as he invited me for dinner at his new house. "Clara's out with friends tonight," he added, "so it'll just be the two of us." I agreed immediately, telling myself that maybe this was the moment we would finally talk. Really talk about everything that had been left unsaid. I wanted to believe this dinner was a chance for closeness, a small patch for the distance that had grown between us. I baked a fresh loaf of oatmeal bread that afternoon and wrapped it in a checkered cloth the way I used to when James was little. The drive to his house felt both familiar and foreign. The streets of his neighborhood were lined with tidy lawns and bright porch lights, every yard carefully curated. His house looked almost identical to the others, save for a cheerful wreath on the door. He greeted me with a quick hug that barely brushed my shoulder and led me straight to the kitchen, where a small stack of papers rested beside 2 empty plates. James poured 2 glasses of wine and filled the silence with talk of weather, his new job, and the neighbor's dog. When I finally sat down, he slid the papers toward me, a packet neatly clipped together with a blue pen resting on top. "Just something for peace of mind," he explained. "It's a standard power of attorney form. In case anything ever happens, it'll make things easier." I thumbed through the first few pages, the language thick with legal terms and unfamiliar authority. My name, his name, boxes to check, lines to sign. No warmth, no explanation beyond what was necessary. I tried to keep my tone steady as I asked a few questions, but James brushed them aside with practical answers. "Everyone's doing this now, Mom," he said, waving his hand as if it were routine. "Clara's parents have something similar." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. There was no dinner, just wine, and the silent request laid out between us. I thought of all the meals I'd made for him over the years, how food had always been our way back to each other, and felt the absence like a stone in my stomach. The kitchen was bright and spotless, but it felt colder than any winter night. In that moment, I realized how easy it is for practical concerns to disguise deeper motives. Families can speak in polite tones using words like security and future, while quietly shifting boundaries and trust. I remembered a friend's story about her own children, how well-meaning advice sometimes masked fear, anxiety, or even greed. I understood that love is complicated, and sometimes the people we care for most can ask things of us that make us question everything we thought we knew. That realization was painful, but honest. I told James I'd take the papers home to look over, buying myself time to think. He nodded, eyes darting between the pen and my face, searching for any sign of resistance. We talked about nothing for a few more minutes. Books I hadn't read, television shows I hadn't watched, before he stood to open the door. The visit ended with another light hug, the oatmeal bread left untouched on the kitchen counter. I drove home in silence, the papers heavy in my purse, my mind racing with questions I couldn't quite name. That night, as I sat in the kitchen under the soft light of the lamp, I opened the packet again. The pages rustled in my hands, each one a small reminder that love and trust don't always look the way we expect. Sometimes boundaries are tested in the most ordinary moments: a dinner invitation, a signature line, a polite request. I understood sitting there that my next step would require more than careful reading. It would require courage, the kind I wasn't sure I still had, but knew I needed to find. And so I took a breath and began to prepare, not just for decisions ahead, but for whatever truth might be waiting in the quiet spaces of my own heart. That night, unable to sleep, I wandered the house, the packet of papers tucked beneath my arm. The rooms felt larger than usual, the silence pressing in with every step. Eventually, I found myself in the basement, standing among boxes of old holiday decorations and forgotten toys. George had always kept his important things down here: folders labeled with dates, receipts for repairs, even a few handwritten notes about the boiler. I knelt in front of the old wooden filing cabinet, my knees protesting against the cold floor, and opened the lowest drawer. Buried under years of careful organization was a small, locked metal box. The key hung from a nail above the workbench, just where George had left it. My hands trembled as I opened the box, half expecting nothing at all, and instead found a stack of envelopes, each labeled in his steady handwriting. There was one with my name, just Martha, taped shut and yellowed at the edges. I sat on the cool floor, heart pounding, and slowly opened the letter. George's words greeted me with their familiar, patient tone. He wrote about trust, about protection, and about the reality that sometimes even family could lose their way when it came to money. He went on to explain that after he got sick, he'd wanted to make sure I would never be left vulnerable. He'd put away a sum in investments, property, and a savings account in my name alone. "If you're reading this," he wrote, "it means you needed to know that you're stronger than you think. Don't let anyone pressure you. This is your safety, yours alone." I sat in stunned silence, reading the words over and over, letting the meaning settle around me like a warm quilt on a cold night. I realized how much George had loved me, not just in words, but in planning for a future he would never see. Beside the letter, I found the details he'd promised: documents showing accounts, property deeds, and a list of trusted advisors. I thought about the countless times I doubted myself, worried that I was being paranoid or unkind for questioning James's motives. Now, with George's careful handwriting in my hands, I understood that wanting to protect yourself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. I remembered a story a friend once shared about her own family dividing over an inheritance. "Money changes people," she'd said, "but it doesn't have to change you." That was a lesson worth keeping close. I closed the box and hugged it to my chest, letting the gratitude and sorrow wash over me in equal measure. I wished I could thank George, tell him that his care meant everything on this night when I needed it most. I understood now that love sometimes looked like quiet preparation, the kind of protection you only discover when you're standing alone, unsure which way to turn. There was comfort in knowing that someone had thought this far ahead, had believed I was worth guarding, even from those I loved most. With a new sense of resolve, I brought the metal box upstairs and placed it in the back of the kitchen cupboard, where I could reach it easily, but no one else would think to look. The next morning, I made myself a strong cup of coffee and sat at the table, the dawn light making the kitchen glow with possibility. I knew I couldn't avoid the conversation with James, but I also knew I wouldn't be entering it from a place of fear. The lesson was clear. Sometimes the strength you need has been waiting for you all along, tucked away in quiet places and old love letters. As I sipped my coffee, I began to write down questions and reminders for myself, not just about accounts and signatures, but about the boundaries I needed to draw. I promised myself I would protect what George had left and what I had built, no matter how uncomfortable it might feel to stand firm. The future, I realized, wasn't about keeping the peace at all costs. Sometimes it was about finally learning to choose yourself, even if that meant risking someone else's disappointment. With the sun rising outside and George's letter by my side, I knew the next step would require courage, and that finally I was ready to find it. It took me 2 days to gather the courage to call Ellen an old friend who had practiced law for decades before she retired. We hadn't spoken much since George's funeral, but I remembered her saying, "If you ever need help with anything complicated, call me." Her number was still scribbled inside my address book, tucked between recipes and doctor's appointments. I dialed with trembling fingers, unsure if she'd even remember me. When she picked up, her voice was brisk but kind, and after a brief hello, I told her everything about the papers, the wedding, and the letter I'd found in the basement. Ellen listened without interrupting her silence, offering comfort I didn't know I needed. When I finished, she cleared her throat and said, "Bring everything over, Martha. We'll sort it out together." That afternoon, I packed the metal box, George's letter, and James's packet of documents into a canvas bag and drove across town. Ellen's home was small and sunlit, filled with stacks of books and photos of grandchildren. She ushered me to the kitchen table, poured 2 mugs of strong tea, and began methodically examining every piece of paper I set before her. She explained each clause in James's documents, pointing out how the language allowed for immediate control over finances, property, even medical decisions without oversight. "This isn't just for your protection," she said quietly. "It's for his benefit." Her words stung, but her patience soothed the ache. She showed me how George's careful planning had created a safety net, a legal barrier that protected me unless I chose otherwise. Ellen's knowledge brought a sense of order to the anxiety swirling in my chest, making the impossible suddenly manageable. Together, we drafted a new set of documents and updated trust-specific instructions for when and how any authority could be transferred and clear medical directives. Ellen insisted that all future changes would require 2 independent physicians' approval and my signature unless I chose otherwise. "You don't owe anyone access to your life unless you're ready," she said. I thought about the times I'd given in to avoid conflict, how easy it was to shrink myself for the sake of keeping peace. Sitting in Ellen's kitchen, surrounded by her quiet confidence, I felt myself grow steadier. After we finished, Ellen slid the folder toward me and asked gently, "Who do you trust to hold these boundaries for you?" The question surprised me. I realized how little I'd considered that trust wasn't just about love, it was about history, consistency, and shared values. I thought of friends who had checked in during the hardest times, neighbors who'd left soup on my doorstep when George was sick, and yes, Ellen herself. For the first time in a long while, I understood that I had choices and that saying no could be an act of self-respect, not selfishness. Ellen offered to hold copies in her safe until I found the right person. I thanked her, feeling lighter as I tucked the new documents into my bag. "You've done nothing wrong," she reminded me. "Families are complicated. It's okay to draw lines, especially when love gets tangled up with fear or control." Her words echoed in my heart all the way home. I realized that boundaries weren't walls, they were invitations for respect, for healthier relationships, even if it meant weathering a storm of disappointment first. That evening, as I made soup for dinner, I replayed Ellen's advice in my mind. I wished every woman facing this kind of crossroads could have a friend as steady as her. The world would be a softer place if more of us learned to lean on others without shame. I knew the conversation with James would be difficult, and I still feared what might follow. But for the first time in a long while, I felt less alone, armed not just with legal documents, but with wisdom, friendship, and the quiet conviction that my life belonged to me. As I set the table for one, the house felt a little less empty. I looked around at the photos of George the quilt draped over the sofa, the tulips finally blooming in the window box. The next day would bring its own tests and turbulence, but tonight I allowed myself a gentle peace, a reminder that every new boundary drawn could also be a new beginning. With Ellen's steady guidance and George's quiet foresight behind me, I was ready for whatever came next. The days after meeting with Ellen felt different, quieter, but also more charged, as if the air itself was waiting for something to shift. James called on a Thursday afternoon. His tone was careful, almost overly pleasant, as he asked if I'd had a chance to review the papers. I told him I was still thinking, my voice as even as I could make it. There was a pause long enough for me to hear him breathing on the other end. Then he launched into a string of gentle justification stories of friends whose parents had faced trouble without proper planning, warnings about memory loss and emergencies, all wrapped in concern. I knew this tactic. It was one I'd used myself when James was small, offering reasons for rules to make things easier to swallow. But this time, the reasons weren't for my comfort. They were meant to sway me. He mentioned Clara's father, how their family had everything in perfect order. I could sense his impatience behind the sweet words. When I hesitated, James's voice grew tighter, tinged with frustration. He was struggling to hide. It just makes things simpler, Mom. For everyone. The conversation ended with a heavy silence, my refusal hanging in the space between us. Later that evening, a text arrived from Clara. She apologized for the tension and said they were only trying to help me look after the future. Her words were carefully chosen, each one polished and inoffensive, but I read between the lines. I thought about how easily love can become transactional, how even well-meaning people can let anxiety and ambition override genuine connection. I remembered Ellen's warning. You're not selfish for wanting to protect what's yours. Sometimes doing the right thing looks like stubbornness to people who expect you to fold. These exchanges weighed on me. I tried to imagine things from James's perspective, how overwhelming adulthood must feel, how responsibilities multiply, how fear for the future can make people reach for control. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the push was about more than love. It was about certainty, about having a safety net that wasn't theirs to claim. It reminded me of a neighbor, Louise, who once shared how her daughter kept pressing for joint accounts after her husband passed. She said it was for emergencies, but sometimes I wondered whose emergencies. Louise laughed, but her eyes were sad. There's a lesson here, one I keep turning over in my mind. Boundaries can disappoint people, but that doesn't make them wrong. We teach others how to treat us not through grand speeches, but through quiet consistency. I began to see that saying no to James wasn't just about the money or the paperwork, it was about reclaiming my role in my own life. For years, I'd allowed guilt and habit to steer me. Now I was learning to steer for myself, to let my love express itself in new, less self-sacrificing ways. On the advice of Ellen, I replied to Clara's message with a simple thank you, not offering further explanation. I told James the same when he called again, short, clear, and final. The air in the house felt lighter, as if the walls themselves understood I was drawing a line. There would be hard conversations ahead, perhaps even hurt feelings, but I was beginning to trust that standing my ground didn't mean closing my heart. Instead, it meant honoring the years I'd spent nurturing everyone else by now, nurturing myself. That weekend, I allowed myself to rest. I made tea and read in the patch of sun that spilled across the living room rug. I baked a batch of blueberry muffins and took half to the library for the staff, just to feel useful in a way that had nothing to do with family or obligation. The satisfaction was quiet, but real, a reminder that life could be built on small acts of kindness, even when the larger relationships felt stormy. As I wiped down the kitchen counters that Sunday evening, the phone remained silent. I realized I didn't dread its ring anymore. Sometimes peace comes not when everyone is pleased, but when you finally accept that it's all right to disappoint those who expect too much. The next chapter would require more honesty, perhaps more loneliness, but I felt ready. I would carry these new boundaries forward one gentle day at a time, learning how to be both loving and steadfast as my story continued to unfold. The first morning of summer arrived quietly, sunlight streaming through my kitchen window and painting gold across the old wooden floor. I sat at the table, a fresh mug of coffee in my hands, and looked around at the life I'd slowly rebuilt one piece at a time. The wildflowers outside had begun to bloom, stubborn and radiant reminders of all the small acts of courage that had shaped the past few months. In their soft riot of color, I saw echoes of the changes within myself, the choice to set boundaries, the willingness to reach for new connections, and the resilience to stand firm in the face of disappointment. James reached out again this time in a way that felt different, quieter, more humble. He stopped by one Sunday afternoon carrying nothing but an envelope and a hesitant smile. We sat together on the porch, speaking softly about the past, about George, about mistakes, and the hope for something gentler going forward. I forgave him, not because he asked perfectly, but because I needed to let go. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't a grand gesture. It was the gentle release of something heavy I'd carried for too long. Looking back, I could see that every step of this journey mattered. The ache of being left out at the wedding, the shock of seeing love tangled up with paperwork, the nights spent unraveling my own fears in the quiet of the basement, the steady guidance of Ellen, the kindness of new friends, the stubborn hope in every loaf of bread and every wildflower planted. Each moment taught me that real strength is gentle and persistent, that a mother's love endures even as it changes shape, and that finding community can heal wounds that family leaves behind. If you've ever found yourself sitting on the edge of your own life, waiting for someone to invite you back in, I hope my story reminds you, you are allowed to claim your place, to set your own terms, and to build belonging wherever kindness finds root. We are all more resilient than we think, especially when we dare to show up again and again, even after disappointment. Sometimes healing doesn't look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like choosing yourself and letting your own story be enough. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. If Martha's story touched something true in your heart, if you've faced difficult choices, rebuilt after loss, or simply found hope in unexpected places, I invite you to share your own story below. Your voice matters. Like, subscribe, and join our growing circle of storytellers. Every comment, every story, every connection is a wildflower planted in someone's heart. Together, we keep each other strong. Until next time, remember, your story is not over, and you are never alone.